back to Solomon's Cave. We have reached the second pre-Socratic philosopher, and his name is Anaximander. He was born probably a few years after Thales, but seems to have died at about the same time. Like Thales, he also lived at Miletus, and is therefore often seen as Thales' student. By the way, if you want to know a little bit more about Miletus, you can go to the video I made about Thales and watch the first 2 minutes. Now, Thales was often seen as the first scientist, but Anaximander actually took science to a whole new level. Though we know little about his life, and sadly we don't have any funny stories about him falling into a well, he seems to have been involved in practical science. For example, it is said that he went to Sparta to set up a gnomon. This is a simple pillar that is set up straight, with some markings on the ground, and then when the sun shines you can see where and how long the shadow is. And this way you can do some measurements. So it's kind of like a very simple sundial. And he was also a well-known cartographer, making maps of regions like the Black Sea. Several ancient witnesses say that he was probably the first to attempt a map of the entire world. Speaking of the entire world, let's get into some of his scientific theories. Anaximander's theories were an interesting mix of what scientists believe today and what is demonstrably wrong. For example, he believed that the Earth did not float on water like Thales did, but that it was instead just floating in empty space. This is because he did not believe that there was such a thing as an absolute up and an absolute down. What an amazing insight! But when he started speculating about the shape of the world, he disagreed with Thales that the world was a flat disk. Okay, good. Did he then believe that the world was a sphere like Pythagoras would later do? No, not exactly. Pythagoras lived some time later and Anaximander had to come up with his own theory. And he seems to have believed that the world was the shape of a cylinder, which he compared to the drum of a column. And the diameter he believed was 3 times as large as the height of the cylinder. Okay, I'll give him points for trying and at least going from a 2-dimensional shape to a 3-dimensional shape, but still it's not entirely correct. Another theory he had was that the moon, the sun and the stars were not objects, but rings of fire that surrounded the world. Here is my representation of what the sun ring around the world could look like. Now keep in mind, the sun did not move along the ring, but the ring was the sun, the whole ring, not just part of it. But why do we only see the sun as one little spot and not as the whole ring then? Well, that is because he believed that the entire ring was covered by thick, dark clouds with only one small opening, and we would see that opening as the sun. And we see a similar mix between modern science and grave error when we look at his theory of evolution. He is often seen as the father of evolution, since he believed that all life must have changed over time. That the first types of animals must have been fish or fish-like and water-based, and that humans must have descended from some kind of animal. All of this sounds very promising for modern-day evolutionists, but let's have a look at the details again. For example, his reason for speculating about the animal origin of humans is because humans nurture their children for several years, while most animal young are independent much quicker. So he believed that humans used to live and grow inside animals all the way up until puberty. And as for the origin of the first animals, they were supposedly formed in the sea or some kind of warm water. But they weren't living a normal and free life. Instead, they lived inside a cocoon-like structure that was made of a kind of thorny bark, and they kept living inside those cocoons, until one day they washed up on drier parts. He speculated that one day those animals inside that thorny bark washed up on the shore, after which the bark would crack open and the animals could escape and live on the land from then on. Now let's get back to Thales' main question. Remember, he was looking for the arche, or the ultimate stuff that everything was made of. He believed that water could explain existence, change, motion, and life. And thus, everything was made out of water. Anaximander, however, noticed that there was something else in the world besides existence, change, motion, and life. He noticed the existence of opposites. For example, the opposites of heat and cold, or the opposites of wet and dry. What's more, each time two opposites would meet, they would both disappear. Like heat and cold, for example, when they meet, the result is neither hot nor cold. It vanished. The opposites completely disappear as soon as they meet. In modern scientific terms, we would call this an exchange of energy, or an exchange of substance, for example, when we talk about wet and dry. And hence we borrow language from the financial sector, from the economy. However, Anaximander would probably disagree with us using those kinds of terms. Because if you use a financial transaction to describe what's happening, it sounds like it's a voluntary interaction between heat and cold. Instead, Anaximander believed that this exchange of energy was not voluntary, but obligatory. Hence he used terms from the legal world and called it paying a penalty or a fine. This way, he laid a foundation for talking about the laws of nature, in some ways parallel to the laws of society or the laws of the judicial system. He even took it one step further by saying that the hot summer had to pay a fine to the moderate temperature because of an injustice that was committed against it, and similarly the cold winter had to pay its fine as well. And this leads to the question of origins. If the existence of heat and cold is an injustice in itself, where did heat and cold come from? The answer is that heat and cold, as well as any of the other opposites, have come into existence after they were separated out from the original arche, or the original substance. And that is also what they dissolved back into after they paid their penalty. And now think about it. Material substances are limited. There is a limited amount of water in the world, as well as a limited amount of earth and air, etc. But there is no limit to the amount of heat or cold that can exist. There's an infinite amount of heat and cold, there's an infinite amount of wetness and dryness, there's an infinite amount of any of the opposites. Which means that there must also be an infinite amount of the original substance. The original substance must be infinite and boundless. And he called this infinite, boundless substance the apeiron. And since this substance was without limits, neither in space or in power nor in time, since he reportedly said that motion is eternal, he referred to this apeiron as the divine. It was more than a substance, it was a god. In fact, it was the ultimate, limitless, creator god of everything. The apeiron was deathless and indestructible. But take note, for Anaximander, this god was not a person. It was instead a limitless, blind force that was constantly dividing itself into opposites, which then in turn become more and more complex, all the way until you have a world with life and a society, etc. But the foundational principle was nothing but a force out of which everything comes and into which everything dissolves back. So, what is the logical consequence of believing this? If you have an infinite substance that is constantly creating, well, it leads to infinitely many universes. Infinite worlds with infinite possibilities. So in a way, Anaximander was the first to imagine a multiverse. So there you have it. No longer was water the original stuff out of which everything was made, but instead we have an infinite and boundless divine substance, out of which infinitely many universes are created and into which they are all taken up again. I hope you liked this video and will subscribe for more. My next philosophy video will be about Anaximenes. the last philosopher of the Milesian school. Tomorrow's bonus video will be my first Hebrew vocab video, and it will focus on big things. So stay tuned for that one. Next week I will continue my series about biblical books, with an introduction to the book of Leviticus. And because it will be Easter next week, the bonus video for that Saturday will be about where in the Bible you can read about the events surrounding Jesus' death and resurrection. For news and announcements, like Solomon's Cave on Facebook and follow me on Twitter @Solomon's Cave.